This video will cover subtopic 6.6, hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction. The focus of this video will be on homeostasis and hormones, so the understandings, applications, and skills will be related solely to discussing hormones, homeostasis, and reproduction will be covered separately. So we'll start with homeostasis. So homeostasis is the maintenance of relatively stable internal conditions within an organism. So all living things maintain an internal environment quite different from their surroundings. So all biological functions really depend upon having a membrane whose proteins are all functioning properly. Remember that proteins are highly sensitive physical factors such as temperature and pressure, as well as chemical factors such as pH, O2 and CO2 concentrations, and nutrient and waste concentrations. So the membranes and proteins must remain in operating condition. And this is essentially what homeostasis looks to achieve, is to maintain the internal conditions that will allow our cells to function properly, or allow the enzymes and proteins within our cells to function properly. So some examples of homeostasis and where homeostasis comes into play would include things like blood glucose concentration, looking to maintain blood glucose concentrations within a certain range, blood pH, so your body maintains pH within a certain range, CO2 concentration is maintained within a certain range. Body temperature, for example, is kept within a particular range of 36 degrees to about 38 degrees. 38 degrees, you're kind of getting on the hot side of it. And so you'll notice here that all of these events of homeostasis, or all these examples of homeostasis, looks to maintain concentrations or temperatures or whatever it is they're regulating within a range. So it's never like a set number, but it's within a range. So this is kind of the range of tolerance that things can exist in, our cells can exist in. And so oftentimes homeostasis relies on competing feedback loops, and in this case oftentimes negative feedback loops. So we'll have a closer look at what a negative feedback loop is in the next slide. But as an example, just to kind of get things rolling. So for example, like when you start sweating, there are external factors such as that heat that acts on the hypothalamus in your brain, which will lead to things like vasodilation. So your capillaries will expand a bit. You'll get more blood flow to those capillaries, and then you'll also have sweating occurring. And both of these actions work to cool the body down. So as the body starts to cool down a bit, this will act on the hypothalamus, which is in your brain, which will lead to vasoconstrictions, basically those blood vessels and capillaries constricting a bit, restricting blood flow. And this will lead to shivering, for example, which will all have warming effects. Now these are kind of the extreme ends of being hot and cold, but these ultimately are kind of some of the mechanisms in which your body goes back and forth to keep that body temperature within this particular range. So how is homeostasis achieved? So to maintain cells, tissues, and entire organisms within their biological tolerance limits, various mechanisms have evolved. So these mechanisms may be structural. Get the pen. They may be structural, so the animal or plant has particular physical features which help it survive in an otherwise hostile environment. They may be functional, so the metabolism of the animal is able to adjust to changes in conditions as they are detected, or behavioral, so the actions and interactions of the individual, either alone or with others, help it to survive in its particular environment. So homeostasis is really a combined result of all of these mechanisms, and a failure in any one of them can result in the death of an individual. So to maintain homeostasis, our body must recognize the stresses and be able to respond to them. So the stress provides the stimulus. This is what we detect, or the change that we detect, or the change that occurs in our environment, which will allow the body to respond to an appropriate manner after detection by the body's receptors. So we need to be able to detect these changes, and then once those changes are detected, we need to be able to respond to them. So examples of the receptors can be the eye, the skin. So for example, with touch, pain, hot, cold, pressure, we can detect all of these differences in our skin. These receptors then pass the stress signal or stimulus into the body so that some action or response can occur. So the stress provides the stimulus, and by applying the appropriate response, the system will exercise control, or the response to the stimulus, or the appropriate response to the stimulus. So one of the ways in which our body looks to maintain homeostasis, or maintain our internal conditions, is through the use of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system will produce hormones. Hormones are chemical regulators of body processes, so they will control various things that occur within our body. So hormones generally are going to be produced in one part of the body. They will travel through the blood or through other means and will affect another area of the body. So endocrine hormones are hormones that are directly secreted into the blood. And you can have non-target hormones that will affect many cells. So for example, growth hormone will act on a wide array of cells. Insulin will trigger cells to take up glucose. Epinephrine will act on a wide variety of cells. That is adrenaline, causing that fight or flight response. And then you can have target hormones that affect specific cells. So there is the parathyroid hormone, which will act on the thyroid. Gastrin, which will act solely on the stomach, for example. So generally, these hormones work in that negative feedback loop. So as mentioned before, you have that input. This is a change to the system. This is where there is some change to the external environment, or sometimes even internal environment. That change needs to be detected, and it needs to be detected by some type of receptor. Then that gets passed on to some type of coordinating response that will determine what type of response is needed. Then that will act on some type of effector, or send instructions to some type of effector that will bring about a change to the system. And then the change to that organism, or basically that change, has to be opposite in direction to the input. So if that input is a decrease in external temperature, then the effector will look to counter that decrease in temperature by increasing temperature. Or, if temperature is increased as a change to the system, then the effect that needs to be brought about is a decrease in temperature. And basically, as this effect takes place, this has to feed back in at the receptor level, or these changes caused by the effector needs to be detected by the receptor, which then should decrease the response by the effector. So as temperature increases, for example, in response to that decreased temperature, your temperature doesn't continuously increase and increase and increase. It will increase to a point where everything is kind of happy, where the internal conditions are okay. And this is because the effector, as it's increasing the temperature, this gets sensed by the receptor that there is an increase in temperature, which is passed on to the coordinator, which then tells the effector, or the thing bringing about the change, that you don't need to cause such a dramatic increase in temperature. So it has a lowered response. So we'll look at a few examples where this negative feedback loop comes into play. And the one big one that Ivy wants you to know about is maintenance of blood glucose levels. So blood glucose levels are going to be maintained through the actions of the pancreas and the liver. So here we have our blood vessel. our blood vessel is high in glucose levels. Those high glucose levels are sensed by the pancreas, so these would kind of be the receptor area. And then there are cells within the pancreas called beta islet cells that will detect these high levels of glucose and will secrete insulin in response to those high levels of glucose. The effector then, or the effect that the insulin will have, is in this case on the liver and surrounding adipose tissue, is that the liver will then take that glucose that's in the bloodstream and start to convert it into glycogen. Remember, glycogen is the short-term energy storage of the body. So it'll take the glucose and store it for times when glucose levels are low. So now, when glucose levels are low in the body and there's low levels of glucose in the bloodstream, these low levels are detected by a different set of cells in the pancreas called alpha cells. These alpha cells will secrete a hormone called glucagon. Glucagon will affect the liver, or act as an effector on the liver, where it will signal to the liver that it needs to take glycogen and convert that glycogen into glucose. Blood glucose levels are too low, so blood glucose levels need to increase by taking that glycogen and converting that into glucose. Now, these two responses create a negative feedback loop, basically. So if we look at that regulation of blood glucose in terms of a negative feedback loop, so we could have a stimulus, for example, of high blood glucose levels, and this will be detected by the islets, beta islet cells within the pancreas. In response to that high blood glucose, they will secrete high levels of insulin. And this will cause glucose to be converted into glycogen, causing blood glucose levels to drop. This low blood glucose level now is our new stimulus. This lowered blood glucose level is going to be detected by those beta islet cells. They will decrease the amount of insulin that is produced, and so you'll have less glucose being converted into glycogen. At some point, blood glucose levels will be too low, and this will affect the alpha cells in the pancreas. This will trigger the production of glucagon, which will have the effect on the liver of signaling to the liver that it needs to take glycogen and convert it into glucose. This will increase blood glucose levels, which will act as the new stimulus. So there's always this kind of feedback loop going on of competing responses between high and low blood glucose levels. So now, when these blood glucose levels, when regulation of blood glucose levels gets interfered with, this can result in a condition referred to as diabetes. So diabetes is that reduced ability to control blood glucose through insulin. So there are three types of diabetes. We'll look at the first two on this slide here. So there is type 1, which is considered early onset diabetes. This is typically considered childhood diabetes, although that's kind of being rethought. But anyway, we'll consider childhood diabetes. So in type 1 diabetes, those high blood glucose levels should be acting on the pancreas, but for whatever reason, the beta islet cells have been destroyed, so they no longer exist in the pancreas. So the receptors, in this case, are no longer present. So there is no insulin to be secreted. So this does not signal to these cells to remove glucose from the blood or signal those liver cells to take the glucose and convert it into glycogen. So blood glucose levels remain high in the blood and can remain dangerously high. This is where treatment of diabetes is done through insulin injection. So injecting insulin and regulating those levels of insulin can help manage type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is referred to as adult onset diabetes, and it's typically associated with obesity and poor diet. So where type 2 diabetes takes place is, you have high blood glucose levels, you have beta islet cells in the pancreas that are producing insulin, and they are producing enough insulin, but for some reason it's probably overproduction of insulin due to high blood glucose levels, due to poor diet. Those target cells, for example the liver, do not express the receptor for insulin, so they do not respond to insulin. So in this case, the liver cell will not take that glucose and convert it into glycogen, or will take too little glucose and convert it into glycogen. Ultimately, blood glucose levels will remain high. So type 2 diabetes cannot be treated by insulin, so insulin injections are not an effective treatment against type 2, as the body is producing insulin, just the cells are not producing the receptors to be able to respond to that insulin, so they are insulin insensitive. So there is a third type of diabetes, which is referred to as gestational diabetes, and this is specific to women who are pregnant, and ultimately goes away at the end of pregnancy, but it does leave them at risk of developing type 2 diabetes in their life. So other hormones in the body include the hormone thyroxine. Thyroxine is secreted by the thyroid gland in the throat. Thyroxine contains 4 iodine molecules on it. And deficiency in iodine can actually prevent synthesis of thyroxine. Now, thyroxine will regulate metabolic rate and targets all cells in the body. So higher metabolic rates will allow for more protein synthesis, growth, and body heat. So basically, like a high metabolic rate, is due to high levels or healthy levels of thyroxine. Now, hypothyroidism, which is a condition due to low levels of the thyroid hormone, is a condition which can be treated with a synthetic thyroid hormone. So for people who suffer from hypothyroidism, symptoms can include lack of energy, forgetfulness, depression, weight gain, feeling cold all the time, constipation, and impaired brain development in children. So having appropriate levels of thyroxine is important for proper cell or body metabolism. There is another hormone referred to as leptin. Leptin is also called the satiety hormone, and it's a hormone made by adipose cells that helps regulate energy balance by inhibiting hunger. It basically is a hormone that tells you that you are full. So leptin will act on receptors in the hypothalamus to regulate appetite and achieve energy homeostasis. Basically, leptin will tell you when you are full, that you have ingested enough food, and that you need to stop eating. So in cases where people are obese, there is a decreased sensitivity to leptin that will occur. And that decreased sensitivity to leptin will result in the ability to detect that one is full, despite high energy stores, which will lead to overeating. So there have been studies with mice, and early studies in mice demonstrated that obese mice injected with leptin experienced a 30% decrease in body mass within a month. Amazing results. This success in mice led to studies on humans. However, the results in human studies were not as successful. Some human patients did lose weight while others gained weight. And any body mass that was lost during the trial was usually rapidly regained after the trial and after the injections or the treatments ended. This disappointing outcome is often common in drug research, where a drug seems promising and shows promising in animal trials, but then in human trials, the same results are not obtained. Last hormone that we'll talk about is melatonin. So in vertebrates, melatonin is produced in darkness by the pineal gland within the brain. Light and dark information reaches the suprachiasmatic nuclei from retinal photosensitive ganglion of the eyes. Basically, that light and dark information acts on particular cells. These suprachiasmatic nuclei will maintain the rhythm of a 24-hour cycle, that circadian rhythm, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So melatonin is known as a hormone of darkness, and the onset of melatonin at dusk will promote activity in nocturnal animals and sleep in diurnal animals, including humans. So during the nighttime is when melatonin levels will rise, triggering the onset of sleep. Now, melatonin levels will drop to a low level at dawn, basically as we encounter light, and the hormone is rapidly broken down by the liver, and this signals the body that it is time to wake up. Now, melatonin also contributes to a nighttime drop in body temperature, so you have a decreased metabolic rate, and also decreased urine production during the night, so you don't have to get up every 3 or so hours to use the bathroom. Now, melatonin helps control what is referred to as that circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm is basically the physical and mental and behavioral changes that follow a roughly 24-hour cycle. And the circadian rhythm continues even if placed in continuous light conditions or continuous darkness conditions. So if you were to travel to the Arctic during the summer and experience 24 hours of light, you would still have a circadian rhythm that would happen. So you'd still follow about a 24-hour clock and want to sleep at your normal time. So this diagram here just shows kind of what that circadian rhythm might look like. So you have a 24-hour clock. You have when melatonin secretion starts, this will start to trigger feelings of sleepiness or wanting to sleep, and then this will eventually cause you to fall asleep, or you will fall asleep, and will help keep you asleep. So in the morning now, when that sunlight starts to hit your face or hit your body, this will start to trigger a rapid drop in melatonin and will cause you to wake up. And during these periods where melatonin levels are low is when you're most active. Now, there are things that can disrupt the circadian rhythm, such as jet lag. So jet lag results from an imbalance in our body's circadian rhythm caused by traveling to different time zones. So as you travel east or travel west, you could move into different time zones where there's different times for light and day. So the SCN and pineal glands are continuing a rhythm set at the point of departure rather than the destination. So basically, like, your circadian rhythm is set to where you were, not to where you go. And it can take some time to adjust. So like when you're traveling to the West Coast where times are like 2 to 3 hours behind, it can be easier to adjust when going west, but if you're traveling east, it can be harder to adjust on that body. Either way, you have to adjust your circadian rhythm to those new time zones. And it has been shown that taking melatonin orally is effective at promoting sleep and helping to reduce jet lag. So this is the end of the video for 6.6, dealing with hormones and homeostasis.